or would it happen for 25 years?
No,
All right,
it went to sleep and I did too.
Okay.
we are live. Welcome to our weekly basic income discussion group. Tonight we're talking about the future, and some of us read an article called "The Four Futures" by this guy. I think his name is Peter Frase. Is that correct? Anyway, I'll correct that in a minute if it's incorrect. So Peter Frase, yeah. And he's also written a book that takes what he wrote in this article even further. Basically, what he's doing is he's imagining kind of four different possibilities of the future, and setting kind of two parameters differently. Either there's an abundance of resources or not abundance of resources, or there's kind of a hierarchical structure in society, or there's not a hierarchical structure in society. And he examines what he thinks would be kind of the combinations of those possibilities and what the outcomes would be. There's plenty in there that I think a lot of us will disagree with, but he also brings up some interesting points. He doesn't specifically mention basic income at all. But he's talking about the future, and I think a lot of the people in here are interested in imagining what the future might look like relative to a basic income, and how basic income would kind of fit into this picture. So the article's from a few years ago, before basic income was as big of a deal, maybe 2011 or so. But yeah, we're going to talk about it. So I'm going to have some quotes from the article up on the big screen here. But quickly, I want to ask people if they had any like overall thoughts about the article. I know David was somewhat critical about some of the factual stuff that we'll probably get into as we go. Yeah.
Anyone want to jump in? David, do you want to say a little more about it?
I mean, just actually some of the references to other parts of culture were incorrect. Like just getting into that. Also, some of the conversation around Keynes is perfunctory, I want to say. I actually listened to an NPR article very recently. It's Planet Money podcast, which they follow up on economics effectively. And they followed up with Keynes didn't have any children, so he didn't have any grandchildren, but he had a great niece and nephew that they followed up with. And they talked to them about like, okay, well, your family has this money, you have this money. How is his opinion of how the future will lay out impact your life? Like, do you work? I believe he referenced like the 10-hour work week or the 8-hour work week. Do you work 8 hours? And these grandnieces and nephews, one of them is an academic who recently retired because obviously it's been 2 generations. And the other is a therapist who works 55 hours a week. And she's actually was talking about how she has to schedule time off for herself and put it in her calendar. And then she gets anxious and ends up doing things anyway because not working makes her anxious. Because culturally, taking a step away from working is so hard for people. It's not even a matter of what your interests are or what you actually want to do. It's a cultural aspect that would probably take several generations to even start to move away from.
Yeah.
So, just some of the references were like slightly off and lacked a little bit of follow through from my perspective. Star Trek, like references to Star Trek not having currency, they do have currency. Not to nerd myself out a little bit, but Starfleet does not encourage the use of money internal to the system. People have resources provided to them when they are a member. However, in the universe, money doesn't exist. Despite the technology, like they do have currency, they do have mining resources going on, they have capitalism, and it's just kind of a very narrow point of view. It's like you are a member of the military when you are Starfleet. Your resources are provided to you as your needs demand. Like that happens with the modern military also. They are providing housing and food and, etc. beyond actual basic needs to some degree, though that's debatable depending on who you reference. But it's just kind of like a very narrow casting of these ideas that doesn't have the research or the follow through within the concept.
I see. So I think something that's true is that he covers a lot of stuff And for anyone who's an expert on any kind of one of the things he touches on, it's going to be kind of frustratingly shallow and maybe not so accurate.
Yeah.
And I kind of felt the same way. Jeff, who's on the live stream, is pointing out that all this stuff about intellectual property and kind of monetizing intellectual property is a little bit of kind of an oversimplification. And I actually had some criticisms with that as well. Jeff is also saying that he retired at 55 and retiring is easy. Well, it's easy for some people. It's not so easy for other people. So I would say that's a little bit of a oversimplification as well. I want to start getting into the article. So I picked a few quotes from the article and I wrote, just kind of like my instinctive responses to each thing. So at the very beginning, he's talking about the end of capitalism. So this is the very first line from the article. And I've got a little bit of weird formatting on there because on my other computer, I have fonts that support Unicode. And on this one, for some reason, I do not. I don't know why that happened. But in his speech to Occupy Wall Street, to the Occupy Wall Street encampment at Zuccotti Park, Slavoj Zizek, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, lamented that it's easy to imagine the end of the world, but we cannot imagine the end of capitalism. Is that true?
Well, wait, hold on.
Yeah, go ahead.
So does he make clear, because I unfortunately didn't read the whole thing, does he make clear what his definition is for capitalism in the article? Like what
He does not, and that's one of my issues with this article. He kind of like touches on various things that he associates with capitalism. So I think this is an important question. How are we defining capitalism?
Right.
What's capitalism? Why don't we go around the room and I kind of want to hear from everyone what their idea of, and you can pass if you want, what their idea of capitalism is. So when you hear the word capitalism, what do you think that means specifically?
I usually think first of people making various trades.
People making various trades?
Of their own free volition with a standard unit of value underlying them.
So money.
And the kind of emergent properties that come out of that.
So speak so we can hear.
Yeah, and the emergent properties that come out of that. So
Yeah.
how supply and demand ends up getting sort of met through everybody making individual trades based on what they want, or supplying resources based on their desire to do so.
Okay, so you're imagining some level of free markets. From that
Yeah,
perspective.
basically, I think of
Okay.
free market.
David?
I basically agree with you, except for I would drop the reference to any kind of currency.
Oh, you would? Okay.
Yeah, because the barter system is a free market, it is capitalism. I can trade you a cow for 2 sheep and then go around and take those 2 sheep and trade them for a cow and 3 chickens. Like,
Right.
that-
I guess I just assume that if it gets sufficiently complex, there's at least an implicit unit that someone could figure out by looking at all of those trades. You see what I mean? Like, even if you don't have currency. I guess I meant unit of value versus currency for a reason.
I think everyone pegs that unit of value differently, regardless of whether there's a currency or not. And that's how people make money in capitalism. And that's my, pegging it is the problem.
What do you mean by peg?
So if I think that a cow is worth 2 sheep and you think that a cow is worth 2 sheep, then
Right.
we are making a fair exchange.
Right.
But if I think that a cow is worth 2 sheep plus something, then I am making money off of that trade, which is me being capitalistic.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, the utility is asymmetric, and that's why people make the trade. Is that
Yeah,
what you're saying?
yeah.
I agree with that. And I guess I'll let other people talk.
Yeah, but
yeah,
I
so I-
mostly agree, except for the pegging.
Yeah, and I think even with an actual currency, it's never perfectly like the same thing isn't worth the same amount of currency to every person. It's kind of
Right. Exactly.
an average.
What do they call the unit of measure? Utility of, how much the first cheeseburger is worth to you versus the
Oh,
30th.
Like diminishing marginal utility.
Yeah, there's an actual economics term for it that I can't think of right
Okay.
now, but yeah.
All right, Abhishek.
So for me, I think capitalism is freedom for trading,
Yeah.
freedom of citizens. So the value of currencies depend on the countries and all, but the people out there should be in a capitalist environment where they can actually they are free to trade, they are free to fail, they're free to succeed. That way I think the country also develops because trade has always been a source of development for the world. and it's a opportunity for everyone to go there and see if they are good at something.
Martin.
So I'm going to take a qualified pass, and let me explain why. So in an earlier meeting, I forget which one, a couple weeks ago maybe, no, one on immigration.
Yeah.
So I Googled schools of economic thought, and came up with half a dozen, closing in on a dozen different major schools of economic thought. And so the reason I'm going to take a pass is because, one, I don't feel like I'm qualified to add anything of significant value to any particular school of economic thought. I've read Marx and I've read Adam Smith and a bunch of others, and still don't feel the least bit qualified. And funny, just as sort of another context to one of our meetings, I don't know if it was the last meeting or the meeting before last, I talk a lot about Stockman's book, and again, I know I come across as a proponent of it, and that's not my point. My point is, it's a school, once again, it's a school of thought, and it has value just thinking of it as a school of thought in comparison to other schools of thought. And you made 2 points at the end of the last meeting that could have been word for word what Stockman would have said, and yet I don't think that you would have believed that you might have been saying word for word 2 points that Stockman might have said. And so my only point is that, we throw all these things out that, what is capitalism? What is Marxism? What is Keynesian economics? And there are people who, devote their lives and with tremendous scholarship to all these things. But at one level, I think economics is whatever you believe it is, or whatever one believes it is. And what your beliefs are drive your behaviors as much or more than, any particular school of economic thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. By the way, there's a book that you might like. It's really short, and it's called Contending Perspectives in Economics by John T. Harvey, and it has one kind of short chapter devoted to each of the major schools of economic thought. So if you're getting into that realm, I would highly encourage you to take a look at it. Katie, go ahead.
I'm gonna pass, and I'm not gonna explain why.
All right.
Sounds good. Richard?
I don't know.
And just to clarify, this can be whatever comes to mind to you first. At least that's how I answered it. Not that this is the definitive definition, but if somebody's using the term, what am I likely to think of? Because that can be a big part of whether people are agreeing, disagreeing, or understanding each other. It's what's coming to mind when you hear it.
Yes. So when you're looking at the article and he's talking about the end of capitalism, what is it the end of that you're thinking of? Yeah.
Exactly.
And certainly I'm not testing people right now on whether you get the right answer and the right definition of capitalism. That's not what's happening right now.
Yeah, an Oxford dictionary.
Yeah, exactly.
I could pull up the Wikipedia.
Yeah.
We might do that.
Well, I mean, anyway,
That'd be
I can change Wikipedia.
Yeah, that's true. So did you want to pass or do you want to say something, Richard?
I guess when I think of capitalism, it's when someone owns the means of production or something like that, and then they can compel someone to do something with the means of money, to work for it, as a maid or mowing the lawn with toenail clippers or something like that. If they pay someone enough money, someone might do that.
Yeah. Okay. Any thoughts, Nora?
If I put all Marxist, thinking as a citizen of developing country again, and how I experience or live or see capitalism, or what I'm thinking about, what is the end of it? I directly think about the class war, obviously, and I think I'm reading USA from books, but I'm living in another country, so I experience other things. So I think end of capitalism or capitalism is something that in Turkey maybe you can it's more invisible, but you can feel it very distinct areas like in workers areas. So I just feel that end of capitalism means that end of the rights of violation.
End of rights violations.
Mhm.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So Jeff says that capitalism is the transaction of economic goods and services in a free market. And Joan Hulan, who is my mom, says capitalism implies competition and survival of the fittest. So I think I agree with everyone who says that trade is an important fundamental aspect of capitalism, markets. So two questions kind of come from that. And one is, are we ever going to live in a world where people aren't trading with each other? And I think the answer to that is no.
Does anyone disagree?
Yeah, like
Or should we take a vote?
well, I mean, I don't think if anyone disagrees, they can raise their hand. But I think we can all imagine scenarios in whatever future happens where I have something that someone else wants and they have something that I want, and then you make an exchange.
You want the Twilight Zone, Last Man on Earth, just saying.
If there's only one person, then people are not going to be trading with each other.
Right.
But maybe he's trading with bears or something. I don't know. Yeah, any kind of future society of humans, or anyone of our intelligence level or something, we're going to want to trade with each other. So there's never going to be a future without trade. So the next question we're going to ask is it possible to have trade without capitalism? Because we talked about trade as being a fundamental part of capitalism. Can you remove the capitalism part and still have trade with each other? Can you still have markets? Can you have trade without markets? That kind of thing. And I think, like my feeling is that, well, in terms of my definition of capitalism, I think trade is certainly there. And I think someone else brought up, I think it was Richard, brought up private ownership of means of production. So certainly, in our society even today, the government represents the collective interests of the people, and there are certain services that and certain, I guess, goods that it makes sense to be managed by the government and produced by the government. Like if you give everyone, a bunch of money or tell them to go to town, they're not just going to build the highway system on their own, unless maybe they did in the 19th century when private industry was building the railroads, and that was analogous. But I think it's better to, there's certain infrastructure that needs to be kind of provided by the government.
But in the 19th century, the government provided them land grants to build the railroads.
Yeah, so the government's still involved. They wouldn't have been able to do that without government support.
Sorry, just to interject, the 18th century, the government granted not land, but eminent domain for people to make private highways and also, private
Canals.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for. So I mean, obviously there is an inherent ability for private economics to take over there also, when you have it at scale.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
I'm just a little bit confused about this question, or at least I'm trying to imagine, are you trying to talk about, so if government owns things, then people are not freely trading them. I guess governments could be trading them if that's a different sort of level of trade, with each other, but
sure.
It seems like there's an inherent trade out there.
Yeah, and I think for some things there's kind of a natural monopoly where it's most efficient and people get the most benefit if it's being controlled by, or managed by the government or a centralized authority or something like that. And I imagine, our infrastructure, highway systems, utilities, we have private utility companies, but they're very heavily regulated by the government. It would be redundant to have, 4 sets of power lines going into, can we close the door over here?
Oh, yeah. But Alex, are we addressing the question of can you have free trade without capitalism, or are we addressing the question of what's most efficiently managed by the government versus individuals?
I'm just mentioning as an aside that there are some things that are more efficiently managed by the government and some things that aren't. And then the next thing I want to say is that I can imagine that as we move into the future, as certain things become more efficient, we might imagine some things moving over from private management to more centralized government management. But just like people will always have a reason to trade with each other. I think people are always going to have, a reason, or they're always going to come up with reasons to make things on their own and trade the things they make with each other. And that is an example of private ownership of means of production. So when I imagine the future, I don't necessarily imagine capitalism disappearing entirely. If we're taking capitalism as private ownership of means of production and free markets and trade and all of that, I don't imagine capitalism disappearing, but I imagine some things maybe moving over to more socialized government control. And then there's always some segment of the economy that follows kind of capitalistic principles and involves private ownership of means of production and free markets and trade and all of that.
Can I bring up my favorite example?
Yeah, go ahead.
So my favorite examples of this are, well, generally cigarettes being used as currency in prison, because prison is a situation where obviously you don't have much that you own or much that you can do, but people still find things that they want to trade voluntarily. And then in the Holocaust, you really had no freedom, and really didn't own anything, but nevertheless they used coupons for kind of like, this is a horrible example, but it's a good economic example. I won't even go into what the coupons were for. There are coupons for privileges that only some people could use, but they ended up getting traded by everybody, the people who couldn't use them as a kind of currency for different things. So even when they had very little, they figured out certain things that they wanted to trade, services or
a more concrete example could be cigarettes being traded in prisons.
That's
Or in Schindler's List, at the end of it, the Schindler gave the Jews like vodka and things like that, so they can use it after the war, because that would be the only thing that would be worth anything.
Oh yeah, that's interesting.
For the record, cigarettes are banned in 48 states and federal prisons now. They now trade packets of tuna.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, they cost about $2 in commissaries in federal prisons, and that is their trade value on in the internal.
And I
Yeah.
like-
So even people who don't eat tuna, it's still valuable to them.
It's still a currency to them. Yes.
Exactly.
And I like those examples because, in terms of the balance of what you own and what you control, like those are pretty extreme. Being a prisoner in the Holocaust, you don't have very much. So the fact that people are still trading there suggests it's kind of never going to go away completely.
So certainly that's an argument for one extreme, where if it's extreme scarcity, then people are trading. And then
I was thinking of it as like extreme state control of everything. Like you're
State
talking about like
control of
how much is
everything,
owned by people, controlled by people. If you're a Holocaust prisoner, you control almost nothing, and yet there was still some motivation to trade whatever you did have.
yeah,
So
I think
I
that's a
guess that's
pretty
just
good
all I mean.
example.
It's never going to totally go.
Yeah. So as far as this quote goes, let's see.
So then let's see.
Jeff Rohn is getting into labor a little bit. He's talking about the ability to trade labor for a wage. Autodidact 314 is talking a little bit about free markets. And he's mentioning debt money, money that's based on debt. And he seems to believe that we never really have free trade, which is kind of an ideological perspective.
Can I?
Yeah.
This might bring up something that's like useful to clarify. So like
Yeah.
free, I guess, always means like contingent on your circumstances. Like this is a better thing than your alternative, but sometimes you have terrible alternatives. At least that's how I'm using it. So like it doesn't mean you have good alternatives. Like if someone puts a gun to your head, you might then freely do what they want, but it's like your
Right.
alternative was death. So
Yeah.
was it a great choice?
It can be really like when you get into it, it can be really hard to define what's like truly free and what's not. So when we talk about free trade, we're mostly talking about letting markets do what they do. Even though people within the markets might individually be suffering from coercion or something like that. Go
It
ahead.
could be argued that people are coerced into working because they can't provide themselves with food or housing or anything
Yeah.
like that otherwise, and that's one of the arguments for basic income.
Right, and some people might argue that, hey, these people are choosing to work and they can quit whenever they want, therefore it's free. And then other people might argue, well, no, it's not truly free because if they quit, then they would starve. So they don't really have a choice, like that kind of thing. On one level, they don't have a choice. Yeah, go ahead, David.
Just to mention it,
Yeah.
autodidact.
Autodidact.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Yeah.
Sorry, that word is kind of blurry to me.
That's fine.
That didn't actually hit the common markets, like what you'd call the commerce class, until the 14th century, and trade existed well before that. Like debt as like a real institutional concept didn't really exist. Nobody trusted them until you hit 14th century Italy / the Knights Templar.
So it depends what you mean by debt. So certainly in even in small scale societies, there's been there's a concept of, oh, this person is providing me something, I am
Indebted.
indebted to that person, and so there's always been kind of at least
To a minor degree,
yeah.
the debt was constantly considered a problem that you would work around. If you look at old religious scripts, I mean, in Islam, debt is still like charging of interest is not allowed, so debt is very much not the standard in Islamic culture. And if you look at Judaism, you have the tradition of the Jubilee, which would be a relief of all debts, which kind of push people away from taking on debts or loaning out things, as those debts could be forgiven at any given point in time. So, like, fundamentally, debt was not it might have existed in the very short term then, but most people did not have prolonged long-term debts.
like formalized long-term debt instruments and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But that was interesting that like those religious measures were there, so it suggests that people would have spontaneously maybe could do more of this kind of thing.
The fact that they had a ban on it meant that they had a concept of what it was.
No,
so
they
it
did.
wasn't something that existed.
But they still were able to prosper within an atmosphere of no debt.
I see. So like financially, it wasn't as big a part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, there's certainly been throughout history, there's been borrowing and lending by people outside of mainstream society, and then like ways to kind of fudge this and get around it. And then there's also been forms of debt that don't really fall into the specific lending for interest kind of debt as well. So Jeff says debt was a big step forward in advancing economic efficiency. Okay, so we have a lot to say about debt, and I think if you look at one of our previous sessions, the one about the nature of money, we do get kind of more in depth about debt on that one if anyone's curious and getting more into that. But let's get back to the future. So my response to this quote was, what do we suppose he means by capitalism in this specific context? So I guess we just spent some time actually answering this question, or what we feel like it means. And I think for the purpose of this discussion, we can say, capitalism is, describes the part of the economy where people trade with each other and there are markets, and where some people are producing things and privately controlling means of production. I can't imagine the end of capitalism. So I think he's right about that. I can't imagine the end of capitalism without also the end of the world, or let's put it that way. Yeah. But yet he is creating some scenarios. One thing he says later is, one thing we can be certain of is that capitalism will end. So I would object to that. Let me actually bring up the article itself. Well, let me see what I said in response to this. I said, really? How can we be certain of this? Okay. And I think we can be certain, at least given the definition of capitalism that I just said, we can be certain that capitalism will never end.
What do you think he has in mind?
I think he has in mind something related to like the Marxist conception of capitalism. He's thinking about Marx saying like capitalism will give way to socialism, will give way to communism, that kind of thing. But something that's very interesting, if you read the article, and we'll get more into this in a bit, is that he's not talking about communism and socialism the way Marx did, because he's assuming that labor will not be needed in the economy anymore. And Marx was very labor-oriented. It was all about the worker. The fundamental value that's created in the economy all comes from labor. So I think he's kind of using these words, and he wants to associate himself with kind of these left-leaning ideas, but I don't think it's necessarily an accurate mapping onto the actual kinds of stuff that Karl Marx and Engels said back then. So let me.
And what's Marx's conception of capitalism? That's different from what we described.
I have a quote that he quoted from the article. Let me scroll down. Yeah, so this is a quote directly from Marx. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished. After labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want. So people want to work, I guess. After the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of the bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability and to each according to his needs. So from each according to his ability and to each according to his needs does not sound like a future in which we don't need everyone to contribute their labor. It sounds like we need everyone to give it everything they got, and for some reason we're only going to give people the bare minimum of what they need, or some level of what they need based on some judgment about what they need. So this does not sound like a utopia to me. That sounds almost like a dystopia, especially if we have the resources that not everybody needs to work.
People working maximally hard for minimum.
For minimum gain.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. I would, in my ideal conception of the future, I would say from each according to what the labor market demands, and to each according to what the economy can produce. So there's no reason to limit what people get if we can sustainably provide really awesome stuff for people. And there's no reason to make everyone work if we don't need everyone to work to do that. So our friend Peter Frase says Marx's, sorry again about the font. Marx's critics have often turned this passage against him, portraying it as a hopelessly improbable utopia. So you can see my comment below, which is it's not an improbable utopia, it's an impossible and undesirable dystopia. Or maybe I framed it before the question.
Can I try? So
Yeah.
I'm not a big smart person, as you know,
Yeah.
but can I try to frame this in a slightly different way?
Yeah.
That might make more sense. So
Yeah.
I imagine there's kind of just a hope for people's psychology here, where people are just contributing as much as they think is helpful to everyone, which could still be applicable no matter how much we really need labor for production. So people
Sure.
are helping each other socially or emotionally or whatever. It's kind of doing what they think is good. And then I don't know exactly how you decide on the distribution here, but whatever, people are so benevolent towards each other that they just kind of give people things according to how they think is going to kind of roughly be utilitarian. Something like that. Do you think that's kind of a more reasonable thing that one could have in mind?
Yeah. I think that is.
That makes sense.
I understand what you're trying to get at, but I don't think that's the Marxist view of it.
Okay, yeah. That you don't think that's what's trying to be described here?
I think that might be what this guy is going for, but I think that might be his corruption of Marxist portrayal.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's accurate. And then I think we can debate as to whether this is a realistic scenario as well.
Right. I guess maybe
yeah.
that's the value of me putting it out there, is just that's something that might be compatible with a world in which you don't need everybody's labor. So we could debate that instead of Marx is presumably not thinking of not needing people's labor at all.
I think that it is a contextual to the article you are getting true. However, contextual to Marx, the article is not true, and hence that is my problem with one of my very fundamental problems with this article.
Okay.
Yeah.
So having thought for a while, I kind of partially happen to agree with him, because I personally think that if we stick to something, being if we believe in something too much and make that happen, I think that's also not right. As in, if we stick to capitalism and totally avoid others, maybe that's also not right, because everything has a drawback. So basically, the best thing for the future, maybe I think he's trying to say is we will be probably going we'll be probably taking few concepts of capitalism that are advantageous to the society, and few concepts from other things like socialism that are eventually advantageous for the society, because we always, as a human being, we always want the best thing. So sticking to one particular thing, we'll have to suffer from the drawbacks with the advantages. But remaining in middle, remaining balanced, we will get a chance to try a lot of things.
A hybrid or a chimeric economy.
So this brings up the question of, is capitalism something we decided to do? And this actually feeds directly into the next quote I chose, which is, humanity has never before managed to craft an eternal social system after all, and capitalism is a notably more precarious and volatile order than most of those that preceded it. So the assumption that he's making here is that capitalism is a social system that's crafted by humans, and that it could somehow go any other way. Now, if we imagine capitalism as just, some people are trading and some people are producing their own stuff, they own, private means of production. Can it really happen any other way? Certainly the government, controls certain things, and that doesn't fall directly under the description of capitalism. But can you live in a world without capitalism? And I think
this relates a lot to your point because in a way, I think my earlier examples demonstrate that no matter how much you try to control what people are doing, some amount of free trade is going to rise, like in the business and so on. So that's just the exercise of people's any freedom they do have. But at the same time, we can facilitate or hinder free trade in various domains. So we can have property rights that look one way or another way, or we can not support property rights at all, which really hinders people's ability to kind of invest and have free trade. And we can also decide certain things are managed by the government, like pollution issues or public goods, like the roads, or we cannot have those managed by the government. Or, we see a huge spectrum of these hybrids, like from Norway to the U.S. Probably there are countries even more extreme capitalist than the U.S. So, in that sense, I think there are various choices at the governmental level.
I think you guys are right. And I think basic income is a good example of this too. Should people's incomes be determined entirely by the private economy, or is there a role for the government there?
That's a good point.
And I think there is a role for the government there.
Right. And some would say that's super anti-capitalist, I guess, depending on their vision of capitalism.
If your vision of capitalism is that everything should be free markets and there shouldn't be any kind of government that's representing the collective interests of the people, then it's anti-capitalist. But I think certain libertarians might feel that way. People at the extreme. But I think most people who kind of think about capitalism, they're not thinking about it as everything in the world functions via capitalism. It's more of a description of markets and a description of the cases when we do have private ownership and analyzing that system that naturally emerges. So I think I would take issue with his assumption that capitalism is kind of a social system that's crafted by humans, that it could somehow go some other way. I think if you had aliens on some other planets, they would also want to trade with each other as their society evolved and got more large scale. They'd come up with money and some of them would be coming up with new ways to produce things privately and trade with each other and all that kind of stuff. So we're just imagining aliens on an alien world who have no contact with us. I think capitalism, in the sense that we've defined it here, would emerge in their economy as their society grew.
And why do you believe that?
Because I can't imagine a society in which individuals wouldn't want to trade with each other at all ever, or wouldn't come up with ways to produce things on their own privately.
I can give you an example.
Yeah,
but you have to start imagining very different aliens. So this is just flesh out the assumptions. So you have an ant colony Ender's Game style alien race where they're all genetically related to each other, and they're all serving the common genetic goal of the superorganism. So you have a very different way of organizing utility because it's really all for the purpose of the queen or the kind of shared gene pool.
You have
that would
each other
operate
in that
differently.
specific example.
So I'm just vaguely saying that, I think given that you have individuals with distinct genes and so on, you're going to definitely get that, but you could get something weird otherwise.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying that specific example. They had queens who had competing interests to some degree. You get the same thing.
They didn't share genes with each other, right? Those queens, or did they?
They were the ultimate individual, and all of their.
You're talking about actual ants, or you're talking about Ender's Game?
I'm talking about Ender's Game.
Okay.
Well, let me say that they all share exactly the same genes. It's just clones. A clone society. You might get something different. You might not. I don't know. But it's worth thinking about.
So I think
You're not worth thinking about.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm just saying that specific example is a little off base because I'm super
I read
neurotic.
a long time ago. So please forgive me.
But I understand what you're saying, where it's if we had a psychic connection and we both understood what values something had to each other, would capitalism still exist? Like, if I would look at Alex and be like, you know, Alex, like, I have this watch. I don't really wear watches anymore. I can psychically tell that you really like watches and you have an interest in watches. Maybe I would just give it to you and there'd be no need to trade. Because, like, I would feel you're paying and yearning for a watch, and I would go, well, I have this extra watch that I happen to have, and next time I see you, I will give it to you because I feel your pain. I have an actual symbiotic empathy for your pain or your yearning, and I would just offer it up to you. So, like, I think that is more to your point where it's like, maybe you don't trade because there isn't trade because you don't have any independent thought, but maybe the lack of independent thought, I feel like, is not.
Well, what I was getting at is like, if you have the same genes in everyone, then the organism evolved to serve not the individual,
Oh, I understand. Okay,
but
sorry.
the collective
I took that the wrong way.
interest.
Yeah,
And I guess I brought that up in part because I feel like Marx is trying to like make people like, or want people to be that.
No,
Maybe
okay.
Marx is.
No,
Maybe
I
this
totally
guy.
misunderstood what you were getting at.
But aliens, I would think if they were like that, then they might operate a bit more like my version of Marx, which is Marx, like what I said. Like they would just kind of like contribute to the collective genetic welfare of the cloned species, which might look different than the kind of trade that we have, especially if they could also read each other's thoughts or something and they knew what to do.
So a
The
question.
reason I asked you
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
real
This
quick
is maybe,
because
this was maybe
I
on
watched the
the whole side.
1920s silent Soviet movie a few weeks ago. That the premise was that the Martians, the people living on Mars, were observing Earth and flashed real quick through the story, and then an Earthling went to Mars and launched a Bolshevik-style revolution and brought utopia to Mars, more or less. Which it was a real movie, and I say that in the context of believing in what you believe because you can't imagine anything else. I could imagine a lot of religions, Bolshevism, and other constructs of people who couldn't imagine anything other than what they believe in. Therefore, what they believe in must be true.
Okay. Yeah, and I like your example of kind of the collective, ants and Ender's Game and stuff. And I think that kind of prompts the question of what constitutes an individual. So is the entire ant colony kind of one individual organism, or is all of humanity one individual organism? If we become the Borg, are we going to be trading with each other? I don't know. So I think
be assimilated, Alex. I'm just telling you.
yeah, if our future is that we're all one collective consciousness, then maybe we don't have capitalism anymore. But we can also imagine that similar trade-offs that we make in capitalism are going to be made in other ways. Like if one drone in the collective is limping and falling behind the herd or whatever, then maybe we still manage our resources as a collective organism, but maybe not in something that we would call capitalism.
So most collective species would actually remove that one who falls behind from the herd.
Yeah, exactly.
They wouldn't. That member of the collective, like Eskimos going out on the iceberg, would just remove themselves to remove their burden from the
Like you
collective.
said before, utilitarian bioethics or something?
Yeah, I use that term.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it looks really different. Like our body functions really differently than individuals. Like our bodies are collective, and we're having to get rid of pieces of cells that we don't need.
Is capitalism happening inside us right now?
No, definitely
Our
not. And
bodies?
that's kind of my point.
Yeah.
Is like individuals care about themselves and their families care about them. So actually, when you have different genetic entities, you don't get people being so happy about being left behind.
No,
The
it's-
way our cells are happy to be shut off.
Well, I mean, even when you have, I guess it's you do still have cultures of humans where the individual will remove themselves as to remove their burden from, because they don't. Yeah, you know what I mean? Like there's still
Right.
that.
I think
aspect.
that's right, but I think it's rare and hard to explain unless you have like enough genetic rootedness between people or like a lot of social pressure. You have sacrifices of humans too in cultures,
Yeah.
but I doubt they're that willing. But maybe they are if they know that they can't do anything else anyway.
Yeah.
Hard enough.
Katie.
I have two friends that were just stuck on the island in Indonesia.
Oh, yeah.
And
They were on
and
Lombok?
or they were on the island next to Maria McGillies. They were doing, rescue, search and rescue, pulling, dead bodies and things like that. And I think that they, obviously not the norm, but they refused to leave the island for no reason until, they felt like they couldn't serve, and they had medical training and whatnot. And eventually, everyone was removed from the island, and they went on that ship. But specifically, they were with a guy that had a broken back, and so that was one of the main reasons they wouldn't leave. The island ran out of water, and they had no interest in it. I think it sounds crazy, but there are actually a lot of people out there that are that way. And what if our collective consciousness shifted such that that was the norm, as opposed to the individual or leaving the pack behind? If everyone started, taking care of the one living guy, it's actually possible.
Yeah. I mean, I can still imagine everyone wanting to do that and still, I have an apple and Bethany wants to eat some of my apple and she has a granola bar and I want to eat some of her granola bar, and we kind of split them up, and then there starts to be trade there.
Trade doesn't have to be against anybody's interest necessarily. It can just be an efficient way to get everybody what they need.
It's something, within whatever context is happening, trade is something that benefits both sides. Otherwise, they wouldn't make the trade.
Well,
go ahead,
the
David.
most classic example of trade that is benefiting everyone is, I can make 2 spears in an hour, and you can butcher 2 animals in an hour, and you can only make 1 spear in an hour, and I can only butcher 1 animal in an hour.
Right.
So you should spend your time butchering animals, and I should spend my time making spears.
Right.
Yeah.
When you get to it fundamentally, it is each their ability is the fundamental part of capitalism, interestingly enough.
If you're talking, because right now you're speaking entirely in terms of labor. This person's labor can accomplish this, and that person's labor can accomplish that.
Mm-hmm.
Gets a little bit different when you have a machine that can make spears or.
It does.
Yeah.
But that,
and I guess one thing I would add to that is we could work that out person to person if it's a small group.
Mhm.
But to have a global economy, you have to sort of it becomes more personal, but it could be the same kind of logic. People are doing things that help each other, but I can't possibly know the 8 billion, the 100,000 people that wanted to make these sunglasses and make a deal with all of them in a way that works out for everybody. So instead, you kind of have the emergent trades.
So Jeff says, and I like this comment, he says, maybe capitalism fades in importance as more humans spend their time and energy outside of the realm of capitalism. And I think that's right. Capitalism maybe is always going to be there, but we might not be depending on it for life or death. We might not be depending on it for survival. And similarly, I think it fades as important in importance as more of the basic things that we need to sustain ourselves and to provide for our well-being become more and more abundant and available to everyone. So then the stuff we're trading is extra stuff, some luxury that I have that someone else wants or something like that. But all of our basic needs are kind of taken care of.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And I think that's the right way to think about it. Instead of saying a world where capitalism has ended, maybe we can imagine a future where we're not depending on trade for survival, trade with other people for survival. I think that could be a realistic future.
But what about if you're getting a basic income and you're buying stuff? Would you call that? How would you classify that?
Yeah, so maybe I guess that is a form of trade. So maybe you're deciding what you want to buy, what's best for you. For certain things, there would be we wouldn't want to provide a basic income and say okay, now you can go buy your healthcare because the incentives are all wrong, and someone would have a catastrophic event happen to them and other people wouldn't, and it's not that everybody would just have the money to take care of their health needs. So there's reasons for things like insurance and centrally provided services and infrastructure that are outside of capitalism. But maybe food is still always something you buy because different people want to eat different things. So that's maybe part of capitalism, but it doesn't feel you don't feel oppressed by capitalism or oppressed by the need to the need to trade, the need to have something to trade or something like that because you're getting a basic income. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sounds like you're just talking about a world where like we're not contributing that much or offering that much in terms of the capitalist system, but we're still being given this money that then happens, that then we trade and so on.
Yeah, something is given to us that then we trade instead of us trading something that fundamentally we had to like work to acquire or something like that. Yeah, but I still think that's part of capitalism because there is a market and there is trade still happening. Yeah. Okay. So. Okay, yeah, universal healthcare is like national defense, says Jeff. National defense is another example of something that's provided by the government. It wouldn't make sense to say, okay, everyone, here's your basic income. You can spend it on national defense if you want. That's not what basic income is for. Yeah. So the next quote is, much of the literature on post-capitalist economies, so I would say I take issue with the term post-capitalist, but that's what he's using here. Post-capitalist economies is preoccupied with the problem of managing labor and the absence of capitalist bosses. However, I will begin by assuming that problem away in order to better illustrate other aspects of the issue. This can be done simply by extrapolating capitalism's tendency toward ever-increasing automation, which makes production ever more efficient while simultaneously challenging the system's ability to create jobs, and therefore to sustain demand for what is produced. So if we're assuming that people are getting their incomes from the labor market, it's interesting because he doesn't talk about basic income, but he alludes to this assumption that people are getting their incomes from the labor market, and if the labor market isn't demanding enough labor, then demand is not going to be sustained in the productive economy sufficiently. So I think this is where he kind of diverges from the traditional Marxist, labor focus. All value comes from labor, that kind of thing. So this is part of what I like about this article is that he's imagining a future in which we maybe don't need as much labor from people, or maybe each individual. It's not necessarily that each individual necessarily contributes labor, even though we do have some labor going on and that kind of thing. So post-capitalist, don't like that term, but I like where he's going. And when he says ever-increasing automation, I would probably say technological advancement, because technological advancement, whether it explicitly looks like automation or not, or something we would call a robot or an automated thing, it helps us save labor and it helps us save other resources too. So that's my kind of translation. Let's see what I said here. So the question I asked here is, does capitalism depend on labor being the most important resource? I would say no, and I think he would probably say yes. He would probably say that labor is a fundamental part of capitalism, that people having jobs and being paid wages is without that you don't have capitalism anymore. I would disagree with that according to kind of the definition we talked about before.
I think the most important thing for capitalists would be money rather than labor. As we can see, the technological advancement, like anybody today is predicting that lots of labor costs will be saved with implementation of robots, and that has been implemented a lot as well. Labor will. I think it might be right now, but I don't know. I don't think in future. And for capitalists, the most important thing is of course money.
Yeah, profit.
But I think labor costs is gonna be saved, and that has an advantage as well. But eventually that will increase in unemployment, so that's a disadvantage. So capitalism totally doesn't fit in such cases like this, I would say. So here the Marx concept, I think, applies, because we can't, I personally think that we can't just think of money, but as a society we have to go together. So if some like some people wearing Asian trades who are running industries, they think of money more and less of labor, then like it's not something society is running in parallel. It's eventually like increasing employment, but benefiting them. So I think here capitalism lacks some idea.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's interesting because we often frame capitalists as needing the workers, as needing and not only needing the workers, but kind of getting rich off the workers and exploiting the workers. But then, as the need for labor decreases, the workers get paid less. But at the same time, if you're a Marxist or a political leftist in today's society, you might say that workers are being exploited even more, even though the reality is that the capitalists need the workers less and they need the labor less, like the labor is less valuable to them. So there's kind of that contrast there. And then you take that to the extreme and nobody's getting paid for any labor at all, and the capitalists are getting really rich, and then it's, in kind of the conception of Marx, that would be like the ultimate exploitation, even though it has nothing to do with the value of the labor.
I guess how I like to think about it is like, okay, what is free trade accomplishing well, and what is free trade accomplishing not well, and in any given context.
Yeah.
And like in this example, like free trade is not accomplishing getting people their incomes very well, right? And so I guess for me, that's where like something else might be needed, like a basic income is what we're talking about here, but you could have another idea. But free trade might still be doing well at like the complex supply and demand issues, like that are really hard to have a sort of central authority figure out. Like, what do I want to buy? How can I have maximum freedom to decide like what resources I use personally, for example, and those being allocated. And so for me, money does a better job of that than alternatives like the government just gives me toilet paper, gives me this and that, because they can't necessarily anticipate everything that I value the most, which might be different from what Richard values the most, and this kind of thing. So that's kind of how I like to think about it. What is being achieved well or not well by the system?
And how can you know what people want and need without seeing what they're willing to spend money on? Go ahead.
In the article, he mentions having a supercomputer or something like that. Well, they didn't have the technology in Soviet Russia, but they could have a supercomputer that decide where resources would go or something like that.
So maybe something we don't have yet. Like
It's interesting because what would that supercomputer? Yeah, go ahead, David.
So, like at the fundamental basis, the computers would be trying to figure out a fair way to distribute resources based on need, which in and of itself is a sort of artificial currency. Like, need being a currency, and like also some like if humans are making this computer, then they are adding some aspect of fairness to it. Like it wouldn't, even if I need everything, if you got nothing, it wouldn't be fair to you. And so if a human is setting up this system, they are going to say, no, listen, David needs all of this, but you should get something. Like you should still get something. And so there's a currency, quote unquote, assigned to fairness there, which like there's a currency for need and there's a currency for fairness that this computer would have that would balance things out or try to some degree. I don't think that human beings could ever create such a system in any way, even if it was artificially intelligent, that would act in such a way that would be actually considered good by everyone.
So
you run into the philosophical problems of like, if you're being utilitarian, then what happens about the utility monsters? They get like huge utility from things, so everyone else gets left out. I mean, there's lots of so weird things like that. It's hard to design for.
So Jeff says that supercomputer will never exist. Laughable.
I mean, somebody can create such a computer, it just wouldn't function in such a way that everyone would be okay with it.
It wouldn't function in such a way that everyone would be okay with it. And in terms of like what would it succeed in doing, the best supercomputer, like what simulation would it be running? I would imagine that the best way to figure out how the resources would be allocated would be for the computer to simulate a market inside of itself, and to have like representations of us kind of trading with each other to figure out like what we need and how resources should be allocated. And can you do that all in a supercomputer, or does it really take? I'm skeptical. Go ahead. Yeah.
Have you guys heard about the Facebook trading experiments? They programmed two AIs to execute a trade with each other. So these two AIs were negotiating with each other, and they had to pull the plug on the experiment when it got scary to them. And by scary, I mean the AIs. I believe that one of them had two balls, and the other one had some amount of currency, and the one with currency was trying to buy the balls off of the one. It's not real good, so
And they had what were their preferences?
the one with the currency was trying to get the two balls for the least currency,
Oh, I
and the
see.
one with the balls was trying to get the most currency for the balls. But like they pulled the plug after they were going at it for such a prolonged period of time that they had actually developed their own shorthand that the engineers who
Oh, I
created the
heard about
AIs
this.
didn't
Yeah.
even understand anymore.
They forgot to give them a time preference.
Yeah, it went on for a prolonged period of time, and they developed their own language.
Yeah.
Like,
Trade
I don't know how long they let it go on precisely, but I know it went on so long that they literally could not understand what they were saying to each other anymore, and they couldn't understand from the code what the language was that these two AIs had developed.
Yeah,
But
I think they were just kind of like repeating words over and over again, like 5 repetitions of the word, money meant something, and 4 repetitions meant something else, and something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, they, yeah.
Yeah, so they didn't really understand what was happening anymore, so they shut it down. I don't know that they were afraid of it, though. I don't
Well,
know, like they didn't think it was becoming.
No, I don't think, I'm not saying scary, like, I'm not using scary in the context of like,
Yeah.
oh my god, like, yeah, I'm
Yeah.
using scary like, this is confusing, I don't know how to feel about this, I'm like, yeah, I'm sorry, I was being hyperbolic by using scary.
Yeah. So Jeff Rohn says humans are irrational, emotional, and subjective, infinitely complex to model, and I think that's right. And no market is going to be perfect, but if you somehow manage to create a simulation of a market that was as good as a real market, then you might have a good way of allocating resources. But then the question is, why don't you just let the market do that on its own instead of trying to create a supercomputer to simulate it? And I don't think there's really any good reason to put it in the hands of a supercomputer.
Anyone disagree? Anyone want the computer?
Anyone object?
Yeah, I think like the term artificial intelligence
Yeah.
it's been quite it's quite understood in a wrong way, because there is always the difference between artificial and real. So computers never can do everything that humans can. They may compute fast, they may calculate fast, they may predict fast. We can like increase lots of like efficient things, but like the emotional part is always there, which these computers can't adapt. I would say.
Richard, yeah.
I read an article last night about how AI can come up with solutions that we could never think of, or something like that. Someone trying to teach an AI to fish, and the AI comes up with the solution that why don't we just drain all the water out of the lake, and that way we have all the fish we want.
Well, I mean, somebody could come up with that option also. Like, I could think, like, I could decide to do that. It doesn't make it a practical solution. It doesn't make it an economic solution.
The question
how to
is
get
whether
this.
they're coming up with a better answer, which sometimes they probably are, or whether we just forgot to give them certain preferences that we're taking for granted, like we don't want to get rid of something.
The
Yeah.
article
Yeah.
the article is about AI cheating. Like they were trying to play this game, and they were trying to, instead of playing it like a human trying to get the most points, they broke the game and they got the most points by doing that.
People have done that, though, with video games. Like,
That is
yeah.
Or
I
they
mean,
trying to make the most efficient use of the cloud they had from this one camera angle, and so the AI cheated to have the ball they're not even gripping the ball, but it was just sitting there. But from this one angle, it looked like, oh, it actually grabbed the ball.
Yeah. So Jeff Rohn has some experience with AI as well. I think generally speaking, where we are now, there are a lot of things that AI can't do that humans can do, like the emotional stuff and all of that. There's also certain things that AI can do because it's so narrow. Like it can become the best Go player in the world because our brains are not, specifically focused on training to be the best Go player in the world, even if we are Go players. But I would also say that you know our brains are a computer. You know, it's you know, we're kind of running very generalized algorithms, and our intelligence is very general purpose. And I would disagree that that a computer or an AI couldn't, you know, have emotions the way we do, because I feel like the distinction between artificial intelligence and real intelligence right now is just based on the idea that, you know, the AI technology that we've developed is narrow. But I don't know that that will always be the case. Yeah.
Like maybe you could create a computer program that, or an AI program that makes it the cutest possible to make a human want. Like I read something about how if a computer pled for its life to pull out the plug, or so it would run out of electricity, that a person would find it difficult to do that. But if maybe they can have, if there's something called an adversarial program or something like that, where you have two things arguing about something, and maybe we could get better and better at having someone having emotional ties to it or something like that.
Like in manipulating our connection to it.
Mhm.
All right. So anyone else have any thoughts about that before I move on to the next?
Oh, this I think the labor is labor depending on capitalism.
Yeah.
I think there is. I thought for Marx, I think it's not the most important resource. I think it's there is more important thing is here who owns the resource. So yes, the labor can decreasing, but it's still important who is owning these resources. And so I think, yeah, for now, labor is a big threat and resource for capitalists, but actually it's not about that he just put his ideas on it, because even the labor is decreasing, it's still important who control it.
Like other natural resources.
Yeah. And the production means maybe.
Yeah. Private ownership of
Yeah.
means of production.
Yeah.
And I think that's right. Marx did say that you know, the value of a good comes from the labor that went into it, and you know, his kind of conception of value was at least based on labor.
Yeah.
So it was important in that way. But I think you're right that in terms of the issues he was bringing up and the problems he was pointing out in the economy, it was very much about who had control of the resources.
And because you say, for example, the labor is decreasing, but we still don't know how, last week we talked about it, how these people gonna do in the future. So this is still important, how they put them into their relationship with maybe class or maybe other robotics, I don't know.
Yeah. And a question.
And I think we were more pessimistic last week. Today is better.
Well, now we're talking about the
because
future.
he say human is more complex. She say, or I don't know, it's better.
Yeah. Go ahead, David.
I do want to say just one thing that
Yeah.
people lose perspective of. The amount of labor that is happening in the world has never gone down.
Yeah,
it is not
sure.
currently going down. It is still increasing very gradually. What's falling is the percentage of people who are using labor actively. So the amount of labor in the world as like an hour of unit of measure is continuing to grow.
Yeah.
It is the percentage of the average person's time that has.
You mean because the population is going down?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just said
Yeah,
this
no,
for the response
yeah.
because he said decreasing the. I
There's
mean,
just a couple of
explosion
things-
is
yeah,
growing.
There's just a couple
Yeah.
things in here, and then
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
a couple
sure.
things everyone, including myself, have said, and like I realized, like, you know, taken out of context, even what I have said myself, it can be construed as, well, labor is going down or is, you know, expected to go down, but even on the current trajectory, the amount of labor human beings collectively perform will continue to go up. It is the amount of labor an individual as part of the whole performs that would go down.
Yeah, and I think this relates to something we talked about last week when we were talking about technological unemployment, which is that we expect two main things from the labor market. One is that it allocates labor efficiently for production in the markets, and the other is that it provides people with incomes. And because we have this expectation that the labor market provides people with incomes, that creates an incentive for us to create jobs for people to do as a way to pay them, and to protect jobs, and to institute labor regulations, labor unions, labor movements, that kind of thing, as a way to keep people employed and get money to them. And that's kind of sometimes at odds with using labor most efficiently. And I don't know if you guys have heard of this. It's called the productivity paradox in economics, or the Solow paradox, named after a guy who talked about this. But he was worried about or wondering about why it was the case that as technology improved, the actual productivity of labor went down, or tended to go down. So people are working the same number of hours or more hours, but the amount of stuff we're producing for people is going down. And that's partly because we're kind of keeping these jobs alive through various economic policies and stuff like that. So maybe labor is increasing still, but maybe it doesn't have to if we have something like a basic income, another way to get income to people. Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the Solow paradox.
Yeah.
But my understanding is, as a general rule, the efficiency gain is going down, but the amount of total output continues to go up.
The amount of total output does continue to go up.
Okay.
That's true.
So the efficiency gain is like total.
Yeah, people are kind of expecting technology to,
Blow up.
to make it so we need a lot less labor, 10-hour work weeks or something like that, and we're not seeing that happening.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for that is that we are making sure that people are still working because they need incomes through various economic policies. Yeah.
What did you call that paradox?
The productivity paradox. You can Google that, and that'll probably come up. Yeah.
Anyway, so Alex might argue that's part of why you see the data that you're talking about with
Yeah.
interesting as high as this. Is
Yeah.
that it's like kind of because
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No,
yeah,
it's okay.
yeah.
I just it's an interesting question.
So Jeff says a higher minimum wage destroys jobs as it increases the profit for automating jobs. And I think, minimum wage is an example of one of these policies where we're trying to get more money to people through the labor market, and it comes at a cost of the efficiency of the labor market when we think about it as simply allocating labor as a resource. So I think that's an example of it. And obviously,
that is the reason we're trying to go into the AI, because we need more productivity. We need more efficiency from the labor. And I don't think so. I really agree with that point. The minimum wage does destroy the jobs, because of course an entrepreneur will level face a loss.
yeah, and I would say that destroying jobs isn't in itself a bad thing, but I would say the inefficiency in labor allocation is maybe undesirable.
So as a side note, interestingly, if people had a basic income, you could see the same kind of effect, because you would have potentially a higher wage you'd have to pay people just due to their outside options. People have an income, they don't have to work. So that could create a minimum wage that people are willing to accept, even if it wasn't legally mandated. So you might still get a push for automation with a basic income in the same way.
Certainly. And you might even get a more efficient push for automation, because there might be jobs or activities that people would really, really love to do, but they can't afford to do them now, or it's below minimum wage now, or something like that.
Right.
And then, these are really fun activities that people enjoy, like taking care of their kids or something like that. So instead of an incentive to, since everyone has to work, instead of an incentive to build robots for childcare, it actually gives people the freedom to take care of their own children. And then we can focus our automation on areas where people don't want to work. And because they don't want to work there, the wages are not becoming cost effective for the employers.
Right.
That kind of
So
thing.
it reflects people's preferences more, because people aren't desperate.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's go. Taken to its logical extreme, this dynamic brings us to the point where the economy does not require human labor at all. I think this relates to the idea that capitalism will go away entirely. I think no matter what, we're always going to have reasons to. Somewhere is going to come up with a reason to pay someone else to spend their time doing something other than what they would ordinarily be doing. Maybe it doesn't look exactly like a job today. Maybe it doesn't meet minimum wage. Maybe you're not working 40 hours a week, but there's, people will still want to be able to trade their time and their labor.
An example of this that I find interesting, and I think it would look different with a basic income, but like if you're, has anyone ever watched Downton Abbey, that show? Yeah, so like there you have a lot of people basically being employed doing things that we don't find necessary anymore. Like making sure that things are served in a particular way at the table and making sure that you basically just have a certain number of people in the room as servants to show off your wealth and like basically just paying people to show off their wealth essentially. Right, so that's like, you can always think of things like showing off your wealth is one of them. You just have a bunch of people dance around and stuff, or dancing like that, but dance around or serve food or, all these kinds of different things that people can come up with. Hopefully if people had a basic income, they would be able to turn down that kind of stuff. But if they didn't, I imagine, for example, really wealthy people could just hire a bunch of people to show off their wealth like they have done before.
And they probably would, but that doesn't mean that it would somehow automatically provide people with.
No, it wouldn't necessarily employ everyone. It's just an example of things we've come up with. Like we have a lot of historical examples of like things we've come up with to pay people to spend their time on. And showing off our wealth is a big one.
Showing off our wealth is a big one, and like tariffs is another one, right? We don't want your cheap steel, China. I bring up this example every week, so I'm gonna stop now.
It's a good example.
So. One in which all people, he's imagining, right, so he's listing his scenarios, his 4 possible futures. One in which all people are treated as free and equal beings with equal rights, equal right to share in society's wealth, or a hierarchical order in which an elite dominates and controls the masses and their access to social resources. So these are kind of 2 extremes that he's imagining. And I'm wondering what it means for beings to be free and equal. So in like absolute terms, like what does it mean to be absolutely free and absolutely equal with each other? And he does, I think later, all right. So my question was, what does it mean for us to be free and equal beings? Does it preclude any form of hierarchy?
Can I add another question?
Go ahead.
And can we be both free and equal?
Can we be both free
This is like a
and
classic
equal?
philosophical discussion.
Yeah. So a libertarian might say, they want the freedom to accumulate more wealth than other people. They want the freedom to, take power or something like that.
So I'll throw out a couple thought experiments that aren't my own, but they're just useful for this. Like one is just this idea that philosophers talk about, like if people make free trades, then famous basketball players are going to end up with more money pretty quickly because people want to see them play and they think it's cool and they're going to give them the money. And now that person, so the freedom to spend your money how you want or whatever, it's going to give them more. And then there's the other thought experiment. If you want people to be truly equal, you just have to handicap everyone. So like attractive people have to wear masks and great athletes have to wear weights and the best ballerina wears the heaviest weight. So there's this idea
that's
that
the
like
Kurt Vonnegut story.
Kurt Vonnegut story. So there's this idea that if people can't really freely exercise their talents and be equal in all ways, at least in terms of like the various things that we value about each other, so that these things kind of could be in conflict.
Yeah, go ahead.
And a way to decide that, instead of handicapping, you could have everyone augmented genetically or something like that, so they're all equal.
But
that
you
way.
ask the same question, like wouldn't you, if you have the ability to augment, wouldn't you want to maybe combine that with the best natural ability? Depends on what you're going for, right? You could see there would still be some costs, unless the augmentation is kind of infinite. But otherwise, if let's say you want really great music, maybe in a way, if you don't augment the best musician as much, it's a form of handicap in reverse.
So you're saying we're not allowed to use auto-tune?
No, I think we're not allowed to go full Gattaca.
No, but maybe my point didn't make sense. But I guess the
go ahead.
absence of an enhancement is like a handicap.
Yeah.
Sorry, Katie, did you ever hear this? No, you're just not. Sorry.
It's my Gattaca reference.
I told her to watch Gattaca earlier today.
Oh, Gattaca,
well, there
that's
you
right.
go.
I knew you were responding.
Yeah. Go ahead, Richard.
6 fingers.
There's actually a program that could that can assist musicians, like not musicians. It can create its own, like if you say dramatic, and the program has all the different tones and all the different instruments, and so if you say dramatic, then for 6 seconds it can create various different programs for that, and you just pick the one that you like the most, and might eliminate the need for musicians. Period. That's what they argue in the art.
Yeah, and we saw the music last week that was composed entirely by a robot.
Emily Howard, I think.
Yeah. So I think the idea of free and equal beings is something that's like clearly debatable in terms of what that even means. But he kind of like, as he does in this article, he kind of touches on things and says like, oh, it's, you know, here's a scenario where everyone's free and equal, but you know, what does that mean really? So his first future is the one that he likes the best, and he calls it communism. I don't know that word is accurate to describe this future, because he's imagining a world without labor, or where labor is not a very important thing. So you can't have like a system of value based on labor. And you know, we already talked about this quote, this passage from Marx.
What does he think is so lucrative in this? Or does he elaborate on this more? Sorry,
He elaborates on this more. He talks about, you know, Star Trek replicators. So you just have a technology to replicate anything anyone needs out of nothing. But he talks a little bit about, you know, like there's some material that goes. So he's kind of extrapolating from 3D printers. So there's some kind of material that goes into the replicator, like matter or something, and maybe there's a limited amount of that. But he's imagining that there's so much of it here that people can basically have whatever they want. It does seem rad. But I think, you know, in the real world, like we were talking about before, people will always be happy to have, you know, even more than what they have, even if they have their basic needs. So there's always going to be a role for some kind of trade and some kind of capitalism.
But I like Jeff here that, like, in his earlier comment, that maybe under this condition, you just see it have a much more minimal role in people's lives. Like the degree to which trade is going on would be kind of on the sidelines if you're simulating whatever you want. Maybe, I don't know how that would turn out, but it might feel more peripheral. Like, okay, once in a while, like, you know, trade Katie a few dollars for a psychic reading or something.
So
I don't know. I just picked the first thing that came to my head.
If you reach your
How
palm,
about
you
a
have to
dance
give her a
lesson? A
hand.
dance lesson, that's something she's actually an expert in.
So
So Katie gives me dance lessons, maybe, and I give her some stats lessons sometimes. But mostly we're getting our needs met from, you know, the replicator or something like that. For the most part.
So Jeff is saying human society has always been hierarchical to some degree, in his opinion. He's also telling us to hang out with a Nobel Prize winner or two. Or he's saying if you did hang out with a Nobel Prize winner or two, you'd realize that being equal is hard to imagine. So Jeff, definitely talk to your Nobel Prize winner friends and have them come to this meetup.
Please bring
And that would be fantastic.
No, but I think I might have brought up a kind of straw man, or like I might have made this into a bit of a straw man, unfortunately. Like, because I doubt he means equal in terms of like intelligence, or the author probably doesn't mean that. I don't know.
No, I think it's some conception of equal rights for people.
Right. Maybe equal
and then, you
resources or
know,
something.
some rights, do you have the right to infringe on other people's rights? And that's kind of where we usually limit, or we try to limit people's rights, that, you know, they can't, you know, you don't have the right to take away someone else's rights.
And maybe he needs equally distributed resources. Like everyone gets the same amount of the 3D printer stuff.
As measured inputs and outputs, and everyone can be allocated a proportional, if not different measures of equal amount.
It kind of sounds like a basic income, but in the form of resources, because now we have these replicators. So
Well,
we just
money is to make
stuff.
it.
Yeah, exactly. So
So
we just kind of make stuff instead of trade for it.
Right. You make your stuff directly.
Like the replicator is the market now for us. Like instead of putting, you know, you can
Right. So you'd have, so I mean, in the real world, you know, you wouldn't be like everyone wouldn't have like a giant luxury space cruise vessel, or, you know, like their own planet that they own that they replicate, because that would take too much material or something like that. He's not imagining that, but there would be some, you know, everyone would get like some level of replicator rations to replicate what they wanted, which is closer to a basic income, except maybe less market based, because you get this material that can turn into whatever you want, so you don't need to trade as much. Yeah, go ahead.
then you can get into that. You know, you want food. Food is carbon based in human context. I mean, not to get into the whole Star Trek alien life form blah blah blah. And so, so you know, there are units of carbon that go into, you know, producing food, and you are allocated an amount of carbon. But let's say you want something that's made out of iron, not for food but for personal use. You have some unit of conversion between, well, you're allocated this much carbon, and now you're trying to use some of it to make iron resource, and hence, well, the replicator can make things out of iron. However, iron is slightly more scarce than carbon, and hence there has to be a trade there.
Right, it's like nuclear fusion happening inside your replicator.
Well, even then, I mean, there's not actually infinite sources of
I think
energy.
he's kind of to maybe defend his approach, he's kind of like giving extremes, whereas
Oh,
the reality would be
I
in
know he's
between.
giving extremes.
So maybe that would apply more
yeah.
to what he has to say about the kind of limited resource,
Mhm.
whatever egalitarian limited resource world,
Yeah.
which he also talks about.
Yeah.
But
I
of
think
course you're gonna have some.
I like
some-
taking his extremes to extremes.
I see.
So
I think the way to think about it is that there are some materials that go into the replicator, and maybe he's not like describing, okay, you've got a certain amount of iron, a certain amount of carbon, that kind of thing, but we can kind of imagine it that way. And it's enough that people can replicate a certain amount of stuff that
Right.
life is good for a lot of people, that kind of thing.
We kind of get bored. We're replicating so much food.
But I think you're making an important point, which is that there's always going to be constraints on what we can produce. There's always going to be a scarcity of some resource or another resource, and no amount of replicator technology is going to solve that. Like even on Star Trek, they don't replicate their own spaceships. They might like replicate individual parts, but they can't make an infinite fleet. It takes them time to build ships and stuff like that. And Jeff is pointing out, does the replicator produce logic and ideas? I was paid for logic. So I would say what he's talking about a little bit is services. So does the replicator provide any other service than just churning out goods, physical goods for you? And I would say no. So there are things to trade potentially beyond what a replicator can produce.
My dance lessons.
Like dance lessons from Katie.
But I can actually dance. You have a robot partner.
I could, but maybe I prefer Katie could.
Yeah.
She's cool.
And that's not to say that there isn't. I mean, there's certainly technology that can provide services as well, but that doesn't fall under the.
Right. And I guess we're getting into last week's topic a little about what technological equipment and what will be.
That kind of thing.
But
I mean, I think by logic he is trying to say creativity, like
creativity.
Yeah.
creativity can't be replicated. It's
Right.
always natural, and it's always once. So yeah, I think he's kind of trying to.
So I would say his line of thinking would be a lot more compelling if he didn't try to associate it with communism, just because communism is this very specific thing, and he's kind of at the very beginning eliminated one of the core aspects of communism by saying we don't need as much labor anymore, which is what I said here. We're trying to explore the possibilities of a future that's less based on labor. So I'm glad we didn't get into like a too big of a debate about what communism is, because I don't really think that's what this article is about. He's just kind of trying to make it about that and drawing analogies to Marx and using these terms. Yeah. So this is interesting. He talks about technological advances potentially allowing us to return to a less centralized production structure. So maybe we don't need the efficiency of mass production as much anymore when we have 3D printers or other technology, which he says is replicators, where you can kind of have a personalized production device in your house or something like that.
It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting thought, and to what extent do technologies like this start to cause us to lose some of the efficiency advantage of mass production?
Because it depends on how efficient these things are.
Yeah. I mean a little bit. Go ahead.
Well, I'm wondering, do you really believe that it's impossible for us to ever live in a world where nothing is scarce? Will there always be resources that are scarce?
I believe that it's impossible. Yes.
But I think that one thing Alex is thinking is like you're including anything on the table as a resource, like the entire planet. Like what if I wanted to own the whole planet or the whole universe or the whole Milky Way? How many Milky Ways are there? Well, there's only one.
What if nobody wanted to?
Right. So that was what I was going to point out about. You might be thinking like within, like for all intents and purposes, it won't feel scarce because it's not really within the domain. The scarce things are not in the domain of what people want. Maybe it would be the point of what you guys are talking about?
So I think that's hypothetically possible. Like we could create cultural norms where nobody wants, well,
To own the whole planet.
yeah, but I mean, I think people will still kind of want things from each other, and they'll be interested in playing games and trading certain things with each other. So, I mean, I do believe we can live in a world where people aren't suffering needlessly because they don't have enough food or don't have enough, stuff to provide fulfillment in their lives. But in terms of, there's always going to be stuff that people might want to trade with each other that's scarce.
But I think
Yeah.
that it's possible that things that the things that are scarce and people want would feel less serious, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
maybe like, oh, I would like to have this planet or whatever, but it's not the same thing as how I feel about like my food or.
Right.
I need to have this planet.
Yes,
This planet is
I
mine.
need this planet, and some of that will have to do with culture. I think, like whether there's a strong, like we talked about greed before, like whether people are really suffering for the lack of owning the planet or
Right.
not, it will be partly cultural.
Well, and if everybody has food, this is the reason I like it, your
Yeah.
basic income. Everybody has food and everybody has, all the basic needs, shelter, so on and so forth. Then maybe the competitive, edge goes to, who can create the best drawing. That's
Yeah.
completely arbitrary,
Right.
right? So it's this never-ending
Right.
circle.
Or
Right.
even like competitions that are less suffering involving like who can win in a video game or something is obviously less damaging than war or other kinds of things.
Right. So who can create the best drawing is still an example of scarcity, but it's not an example of something that's going to harm anyone.
And life and death is no longer
Right.
an issue.
Richard.
There's this anime called Denoil Coil, and it inspired Google Glass actually. That's actually one of the things that you said that inspired it. And they wear these glasses that you can see virtual world, that like you have a virtual pet that it could feel like you're actually touching it, but it's just
That's a good point,
graphics.
Dave. Everyone can own their own planet in virtual
Mhm.
reality.
That's how I was thinking.
All right.
That's a good point, Richard.
There you go.
Richard has combined two of your favorite, added another favorite thing of yours to talk about.
Yeah. So back to the issue of can we decentralize production? I think Jeff makes a good point that the technology is incredibly complex, and it makes decentralization hard. And then there's also the issue of like, if we do need a bunch of different materials, a bunch of different elements and stuff like that to go into the machine in the first place, it's probably more efficient to have all the materials in a central location produced centrally. And you can always kind of imagine benefits to centralized, efficiency benefits to more centralized production. And I don't think that's going to go away. Yeah, go ahead.
Just like a current modern example, that would be silica,
Silica.
sand.
Yeah.
There are 4 kinds of sand that are commonly used. There's like river/ocean sand, which is used to replenish seasides. Like when we get a hurricane, people truck it in and they buy it, and it's worth actually quite a bit of money. And the amount of that available for sale is constantly diminishing on there.
Yeah.
It's very recently a huge problem. There's the kind of silica that is used to make like microchips, which is a finite resource at the end of the day. Like there's some trajectory that they project that we will be out of silica to create new microchips in like 21 something at the current rate of acceleration of production. But fundamentally these resources are finite on the earth. And I just want to give like a real example of that where people are looking at these as real problems right now. People are stealing sand from each other.
What?
Right.
Yeah.
No, there's also like communities in Africa where the sand from the river has been taken away, and the local peoples there had traditionally used it to like store water
Yeah.
and like keep things cool and stuff like that. We don't have that anymore.
Yeah, and
So
sometimes
they
it
have
was
access to water,
taken
yeah.
from them and they did not
Right.
sell it even.
Yeah.
So I just can't imagine a society without, even with a fair distribution of resources where people are taking from each other, because somebody will always want more than their quote unquote fair share. And then you would have people, like right now, there are people who subside off of, what our society has kind of given in place of a basic income, food stamps, and, housing vouchers, et cetera, who gamble them away.
So yeah, I mean, I think these are good points, and the gambling one is tricky. If someone takes their basic income and takes it to the casino and loses it all, or worse yet, they go into so much debt that any future basic income they get has to go to the casino. Like there's
Or it's like garnished, like for child support or something.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And I think I think that's going to be a challenge. That's going to be tricky. We might start looking at stuff like that, more like a mental health thing. I mean, we already see gambling addiction as a mental
You
health.
could also do something legally, like you could have, you could be that you can't go into debt with your future basic income, for example.
That's
Legally.
yeah. I mean, that's going to be hard to enforce, but yeah. Anyway, what was the other thing we were saying? Scarcity of sand. Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be a scarcity of something. Oh, in terms of people always wanting to take things from each other, I mean, there's going to be some of that. Nobody's ever going to be. I mean, there's always going to be people who aren't perfect, and nobody's perfect. But I do think that a lot of the incentive for stealing and taking comes from survival. Comes from like not all of it, but certainly it can get better with a basic income. Yeah, but I do think you make a good point.
What's the name of the poker movie?
The poker movie, Molly's Game.
Yeah, so this was about high stakes poker, which is a little bit like this, like, because you really flush people. They're very resource rich, but like some of them are very motivated to like gamble and like take money from other people and just to win, like in a certain way, right? To win in these kind of game contexts.
Yeah.
But in a way to take from each other to do that. So
Yeah.
I guess that gets into the kind of cultural stuff that Katie was talking about too, and maybe influencing those things on more of a cultural level would be necessary.
So Jeff says basic income is week to week, as most lottery winners go broke with the exception of his math PhD. So he likes to brag about people he knows. Yeah, and I think that's right. So basic income is a smoother thing than like a sudden windfall or something like that. That doesn't mean like if everybody knows you're getting a basic income, they know that you've got a stream of money coming in, and they're happy to take it from you and take promises from you and that kind of thing. So something to watch out for.
Right.
So maybe that's something we see in the future. So I quickly want to go through the other features that he's listing. So this first one, egalitarianism and abundance, is the idea that everybody's free and equal. And we also have replicators, or the equivalent of Star Trek replicators that can produce everything for everyone. I don't think this is, I think this is the closest to kind of what we'd see with the basic income, but I don't imagine a future where we're not going to be having money, and trading with each other. It just might not be, if you don't have enough money, you starve or suffer or that kind of thing, because you'll be getting your basic income and like all of that. Yeah, so he brings up Star Trek and the replicators. So I said, do we think that post-scarcity is a useful term to describe any economy? There will always be a scarcity of something. How useful is it to imagine a future in which we can replicate literally anything out of thin air? And I think we've all come up with examples here about how that's taking it to that extreme is not useful. And he was saying, he walked back a little bit when he was talking about egalitarianism. He was admitting that there are hierarchies. It's not a world of no hierarchies, but one of many hierarchies. The world we live in is a world of many hierarchies. But he's also saying no one hierarchy is superior to the others, and I don't know what that means.
I think he means like you can be the best musician, but it's unlikely that you'll also be the best football player or something.
See, I took that totally differently. I took it as meaning that there will always be a system of hierarchy, and saying that one system of hierarchy is distinctly better than any other system of hierarchy is unfair, because some people will benefit from being at the top of the hierarchy, and other people will benefit from being at the top of the hierarchy.
Yeah. So I think the idea that all hierarchies are somehow at the same level or equivalent to each other is kind of as absurd as the idea that there would just be no hierarchy.
I'm saying I agree with it, but I thought is
So the second future is hierarchy and abundance. So you've got people who are controlling all the resources, but there are enough resources for everyone, but you have to go to the person in power, and you are subservient to them or dependent on them entirely. So this is kind of one of his other extremes, where we have the abundance, but there's people controlling all the resources. But he's also imagining, we've talked about this before, that people, like to accumulate money, and that's somehow hurting everybody else. And I would say that this assumption is not necessarily correct, and the ability to accumulate money does not depend on the material deprivation of others, unless you're literally using that money to buy the material that would have gone to those others.
Like if it's literally just sitting in a bank account.
Sitting in a bank account is not hurting anyone, and you can give other people a basic income so they can access the resources that aren't being purchased by the guy with the huge bank account.
So would you say you could think of as an extreme, it's like a point system? Like literally they're just sitting on a bunch of points in a game? If they're not spending it, if it's just like in a bank account.
Yeah, they feel good about their money. They know they have the potential to spend it, and yeah, it's not hurting anyone else. So I think maybe there's like some hierarchies can be harmful to people, but I don't think necessarily on its own accumulating a bunch of money it hurts other people. Certainly, you could use your money to hurt people, to buy things that hurt people. Yeah.
At the beginning, Jeff said that intellectual property rights expire, but you can. I could imagine them being like copyrights, like for Mickey Mouse or whatever, that never expires. They keep renewing copyright.
Oh, is it copyright? I thought they trademarked Mickey Mouse.
Trademarks last forever, but
they could keep renewing it through acts of Congress or something.
Yeah. But yeah. My comment on this one was just so dumb. Oh, right. So
I thought you were saying your comment was dumb, but then I started.
No, my comment, the content of my comment was that this was dumb. So Jaron Lanier wrote a book called "You Are Not a Gadget," and it explicitly calls for the imposition of artificial scarcity on digital content in order to restore its value. So this is kind of a little bit like what we were talking about last year with people selling their own data and stuff like that. And I think Jaron Lanier was one of the authors on that paper as well that Martin shared with us last week. But yeah, this is the idea of making up things, creating more laws and restrictions, just like the intellectual property laws, where people are buying and selling things that we really have the technology to distribute and hand out for free. And I think this is kind of backwards thinking. We don't need an excuse to give people money. We can just give them money.
Is this a little like paying farmers to burn crops? Just kind of like wastefully imposing scarcity to up the value of something. Is that something people are giving their money?
It's less like paying farmers to burn crops and more like paying to buy an ebook or to download a movie or something like that. It's it's closer to like intellectual property. He's talking about creating more classes of intellectual property that protecting digital assets that really if I copy your book, you still have that book. I haven't stolen anything from you. So I don't think that's an efficient way to generate income for people. Yeah. Unless I try to take credit for the book, then I'm being a jerk. Yeah, so we've talked about this before, but he's under the assumption that you need to tax people in order to distribute money, and I don't think that that's accurate. If the economy has the capacity to respond to the additional spending, to produce the stuff, then taking money away from that rich guy that's just sitting in his bank account isn't going to somehow free up resources for people. And this is kind of counterintuitive, so I won't get into it right now, but that was just my comment there. So then he gets into egalitarianism and scarcity. So there isn't enough stuff, but we somehow, we don't have hierarchies and we're kind of distributing it fairly to everyone. He's not talking about basic income, but I imagine that you would adjust the optimal level of basic income based on how many resources there are for people. So if there aren't very many resources, then you have a lower basic income, and maybe people's basic food needs and housing and stuff like that are met, but not everyone can afford to buy a car or something like that. And that's more of a kind of a capitalistic view of it, where you're buying stuff from the market, and then of course there's still stuff that's being provided by the infrastructure that's being provided by the government. Basic income is part of that. And then we're getting down to the wire. So I'm just going through these for people who haven't read it. and certainly if you have anyone.
Exterminism, oh yeah.
So this one he calls exterminism, and he spins this story about how if you have like absolute control of the power and a scarcity of resources, then it will inevitably be the case that the rich will decide to kill off the poor and just exterminate them.
So they don't use up so many.
So they don't, or so that they don't like rise up because they're not getting the resources they need. I think this is unrealistic, but go ahead.
In Elysium, they actually have. He talks about them going into enclaves, but in Elysium they have their enclave in space, and they have like this ultimate healing technology and stuff like that. And while people on Earth are just still using bandages and things.
Right.
Yeah, so there's certainly a lot of sci-fi futuristic stories that look like this, and I think he got this term from a sci-fi book he read. Yeah, and I would say he's talking about I would argue that the labor of the global working class even today plays much less of a role in supporting the rich than we tend to assume. It's not really true that the rich are getting rich off the backs of the working class. The rich simply have access to the economy's production, which we can give access to other people through.
Right. But
through basic
wealthy
income.
people also don't have absolute political power at the moment. So.
Yeah, if you have absolute political power and you want to be a jerk and you want to kill people, that would be bad for society. But I don't think we have to end up here. I think we have a pretty good future ahead of us. Yeah.
Hitler didn't die a good death.
So people who try to exterminate will get their just deserved.
Yeah. I think we do have scarce resources, but we have enough resources to really do a lot better than we're doing now if we allocate them efficiently among people. So that's the discussion. Got kind of fast there at the end, as it always does, because we never get through everything. But this is great. Thanks everyone for coming out. We probably had the most active live stream that we've ever had. So thanks Jeff and Joan and all the other people who are watching.
And there was one other person.
And what was his name?
I don't
Audio
get that.
Didax 341 or whatever his name is.